In the intricate ecosystem of municipal government, power flows through multiple channels. City councilmen control budgets, mayors set priorities, department heads implement policies, and judges, theoretically independent, interpret and apply the law within their jurisdictions. Most of the time, these branches coexist in productive tension, each checking the others, each respecting constitutional boundaries that separate their authorities. But occasionally, an elected official begins to believe that political power transcends those boundaries. They start to view judges not as independent arbiters of law, but as bureaucrats subject to political pressure. When this happens, when a politician threatens judicial independence itself, the response can be swift, severe, and career-ending. This is the story of one such politician, a man whose 12 years on the Providence City Council convinced him that budget authority made him untouchable. What transpired in Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom on a March morning would expose not just one corrupt official, but an entire network of bribery, intimidation, and abuse of power that had infected city government for years. It began, as so many corruption cases do, with something small: a parking ticket, a fire lane violation, the kind of minor infraction that powerful people often believe shouldn't apply to them. But this parking ticket would become the thread that unraveled one of the most significant political corruption scandals in Providence history. Anthony "Tony" DeLuca had represented Ward 5 on the Providence City Council for 12 years. His political career had followed a familiar trajectory: early idealism gradually corroded by the seductive temptations of power and money. He had entered public service with genuine intentions, believing he could improve his neighborhood, create opportunities for constituents, and leave the city better than he found it. But somewhere along the way, DeLuca discovered that his position offered opportunities for personal enrichment that far exceeded his council salary. Developers needed zoning variances. Contractors wanted city contracts. Business owners sought favorable regulatory treatment. And all of them were willing to pay for DeLuca's influence. By his 5th year in office, DeLuca had established a system: cash payments disguised as consulting fees, favorable votes in exchange for envelopes of money, threats against anyone who questioned his decisions. It was corruption dressed up as business as usual. By his 10th year, DeLuca had become brazen. He no longer worried about consequences because he controlled the budget committee that determined funding for virtually every city department, including the municipal court system. This, he believed, made him untouchable. Judges who wanted adequate resources would accommodate his requests. Those who didn't would find their budgets slashed, their courtrooms understaffed, their authority diminished. It was a simple calculation. Political power trumped judicial independence. This calculation would prove catastrophic. What Anthony DeLuca didn't know was that his corruption had attracted attention far beyond the municipal courthouse. 6 months before his courtroom appearance, Judge Maria Santos from the Providence Family Court had approached Judge Frank Caprio with concerns. Her brother, a mid-level employee in the city planning department, had noticed disturbing patterns in contract awards and zoning decisions. Every favorable decision seemed to benefit the same group of developers. Every city contract seemed to involve the same consulting company, Urban Planning Advisors, LLC. And every trail led back to Councilman DeLuca. Judge Santos didn't want to believe it. She had known DeLuca socially, had even supported his first campaign. But the evidence her brother provided was compelling enough that she felt obligated to bring it to someone she trusted. Judge Caprio listened carefully, reviewed the documentation, and made a decision that would change Providence politics forever. He contacted the FBI. Special Agent Catherine Morrison, from the Bureau's Public Corruption Unit, had been looking for an entry point into Providence city government for months. Rumors of corruption had circulated for years, but building a prosecutable case required evidence: wiretaps, financial records, Witnesses willing to testify. Judge Caprio's contact provided that entry point. Within 2 weeks, federal prosecutors secured wiretap authorizations for DeLuca's office phone, cell phone, and City Hall office. Within a month, they had identified his shell company and begun tracing financial transactions. Within 3 months, they had recorded dozens of conversations involving bribery, extortion, and threats against city employees who questioned DeLuca's decisions. But the most damaging recording came from a conversation DeLuca never suspected was being monitored. A phone call to the deputy mayor, bragging about his control over judges through budget manipulation. That recording would become the centerpiece of a federal case that would ultimately destroy DeLuca's career and expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of city government. Tuesday morning, March 12th, began unremarkably in Providence Municipal Court. Judge Caprio arrived at his customary hour, reviewed his docket, and prepared for what appeared to be a routine day of traffic violations and minor infractions. But this day was different. Among the scheduled cases was one that had been carefully orchestrated over 3 months of investigation, the parking violation case of Councilman Anthony DeLuca. At 10 a.m., the courtroom doors opened, and DeLuca entered with the bearing of a man who had never faced real consequences for anything. His expensive Italian suit spoke of success beyond a city councilman's salary. His Rolex Presidential gleamed ostentatiously. His entire demeanor radiated the confidence of someone who believed political power insulated him from accountability. Behind him walked Vincent Romano, a defense attorney whose client list read like a who's who of Providence's political elite. Romano carried himself with the smooth assurance of someone who had negotiated favorable outcomes for powerful clients many times before. What neither man knew was that this hearing had been coordinated with federal law enforcement. In the back row of the courtroom, dressed in civilian clothes, sat FBI Special Agent Catherine Morrison. 2 rows behind her, Assistant Attorney General David Chen reviewed case files while monitoring the proceedings. They weren't there to observe. They were there to arrest. Councilman Anthony DeLuca, the court clerk announced, reading from the docket. Case number MC 2024-6892, parking in a fire lane at City Hall. Fine, $200. DeLuca approached the defendant's stand with casual arrogance. Your Honor, Councilman Anthony DeLuca, representing Ward 5 on the Providence City Council for the past 12 years. I'm here regarding what I believe is a misunderstanding about designated parking at City Hall. Judge Caprio looked up from his paperwork, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes alert. Those who knew him well recognized something significant was about to unfold. Councilman DeLuca, you're charged with parking in a clearly marked fire lane at City Hall for over 2 hours. Can you explain what happened? DeLuca's smirk conveyed his confidence. Your Honor, as an elected member of the City Council, I have certain operational needs that sometimes require parking in locations that provide immediate access to City Hall. I was attending an emergency budget meeting and the regular parking was full. The fire lane was the most practical option given the urgent nature of city business. So you decided that because you're a councilman, fire safety regulations don't apply to you. Your Honor, I think there's a misunderstanding about how city government operations work. Elected officials often need flexibility in these matters to serve constituents effectively. Judge Caprio set down his pen deliberately. Councilman DeLuca, were you responding to an actual emergency, a fire, medical crisis, anything that would justify blocking emergency vehicle access? DeLuca's irritation began showing. Your Honor, city business is always urgent when you're serving 35,000 constituents. Every meeting I attend is important. That's not what I asked, Councilman. Was there an emergency that justified blocking a fire lane? DeLuca exchanged a glance with his attorney. The calculation was visible in his eyes. Should he continue with polite excuses or deploy his political leverage? Your Honor, I've been on the city council for 12 years. I've worked with 4 different mayors. I chair the budget committee which oversees this court's funding. I think we can handle this situation with some mutual understanding of how city government operates. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. DeLuca had just implied that he controlled Judge Caprio's budget and expected preferential treatment because of it. Judge Caprio's expression didn't change, but his voice took on a new edge. Councilman DeLuca, are you suggesting that your position on the budget committee should influence how I handle your parking violation? DeLuca, emboldened by years of successful intimidation, pressed forward. Your Honor, I'm simply pointing out that we all work for the city. We all have roles to play. The Budget Committee makes funding recommendations. You preside over this courtroom. Perhaps we can find a resolution that acknowledges both our positions. That sounds like a threat, Councilman. Romano, the attorney, intervened smoothly. Your Honor, my client is simply noting the interconnected nature of city government. There's no threat implied, just an observation about institutional relationships. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair. Councilman DeLuca, let me ask you something. Do you remember a conversation you had on February 15th with Deputy Mayor Richard Santoro? DeLuca's confident expression faltered slightly. Your Honor, I have many conversations with city officials. I don't recall specific dates. Let me refresh your memory. On February 15th at 2:47 p.m., you called Deputy Mayor Santoro from your City Hall office. Do you remember that conversation now? DeLuca's face began paling. Your Honor, I'm not sure how that's relevant to a parking ticket. Oh, it's very relevant, Councilman, because in that conversation you discussed something very interesting. Judge Caprio opened a file folder and pulled out a transcript. You told Deputy Mayor Santoro, and I quote, Judge Caprio dismissed another one of my tickets last year. If he gives me any trouble this time, I'll make sure his court budget gets cut in half. That old fool needs to remember who controls the money. The courtroom erupted in shocked reactions. DeLuca looked as though he'd been physically struck. Romano frantically searched through his briefcase. Your Honor, DeLuca's voice shook. I don't know where you got that information, but I invoke my right to privacy. There is no right to privacy for conversations about threatening judicial independence, Councilman. Judge Caprio pulled out another document. Agent Morrison, could you join us, please? From the back of the courtroom, FBI Special Agent Morrison stood and walked forward, displaying her credentials. The atmosphere immediately shifted from routine court proceeding to federal investigation. Councilman DeLuca, Judge Caprio continued. For the past 3 months, the FBI has been investigating corruption in Providence city government. You've been under surveillance the entire time. We have wiretap authorization for your office phone, your cell phone, and your City Hall office. Agent Morrison opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Your Honor, our investigation has uncovered the following. Between January 2023 and March 2024, Councilman DeLuca accepted approximately $380,000 in bribes from developers and contractors seeking favorable zoning decisions and city contracts. The payments were disguised as consulting fees to a shell company DeLuca created called Urban Planning Advisors, LLC. She produced photographs. These are surveillance photos showing Councilman DeLuca meeting with developers and accepting cash envelopes at various restaurants throughout Providence. In exchange for these payments, DeLuca used his position as Budget Committee Chair to influence contract awards and push through zoning variances that benefited his paying clients. Morrison continued. Our wiretaps have also recorded Councilman DeLuca threatening at least 6 different city officials who opposed his corruption, threatening to cut funding to departments, ruin careers, and in one case, threatening physical harm to a city employee who discovered irregularities in contract bidding. DeLuca was visibly shaking. The arrogance had completely evaporated. Your Honor, I want my attorney. You have your attorney right here, Councilman. Judge Caprio's voice was cold. Now, let me play you something else you said when you thought nobody was listening. Judge Caprio activated an audio recording. DeLuca's voice filled the courtroom, unmistakable in its clarity. Listen, Johnny, the judge thinks he's untouchable because he's popular. But I've got the votes on the budget committee. If Caprio doesn't play ball, we'll cut his court funding so deep, he'll be working in a closet. These judges need to remember they work for us, not the other way around. And if that doesn't work, we'll find something in his past. Make something up if we have to. Nobody threatens my operation and gets away with it. The courtroom descended into chaos. People gasped audibly. Some shouted in disbelief. Romano looked as though he wished he could disappear. DeLuca had gone pale and was sweating visibly. Judge Caprio stopped the recording. Councilman DeLuca, you just heard yourself threatening to fabricate evidence against a sitting judge because he wouldn't accommodate your corruption. You threatened the independence of the judiciary. You attempted to corrupt the legal system itself. Agent Morrison stepped forward with handcuffs. Anthony DeLuca, you are under arrest for bribery of public officials, conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, attempted intimidation of a judge, and corruption of public processes. You have the right to remain silent. As Morrison read DeLuca his Miranda rights, 2 uniformed FBI agents entered the courtroom. DeLuca stood frozen, unable to process that his political career was ending in handcuffs before witnesses. Your Honor, please. DeLuca finally found his voice. This is all a misunderstanding. I was just talking. I never actually did anything to you. Councilman, you attempted to corrupt judicial independence. You threatened to fabricate evidence against a judge. That's not just talking. That's a federal crime. Judge Caprio stood from his bench. Councilman DeLuca, I want you to know something. When you threatened me 2 weeks ago, when you said you'd cut my budget and destroy my reputation, you made a critical error. You assumed I cared more about my budget than about justice. You assumed I could be intimidated. You assumed that because you'd gotten away with corruption for 12 years, you'd continue getting away with it. The judge walked closer to the defendant's stand. But what you didn't know is that Judge Maria Santos came to me 6 months ago. Her brother works in the city planning department, and he noticed irregularities in contract awards that all seemed to benefit your shell company. She asked me to help investigate. DeLuca looked as though he might collapse. So for 3 months, while you were threatening me, while you were planning how to destroy my career if I didn't bend to your corruption, I was working with the FBI, wearing a wire myself, gathering evidence against you. The phone call you made to me last month asking me to dismiss your previous tickets, I recorded it. Every threat, every attempt at intimidation, every corrupt bargain you proposed, all recorded and documented. DeLuca's voice was barely audible. Your Honor, I'll cooperate. I'll tell you everything. I'll testify against the others involved. I'll resign from the council. Please. Judge Caprio's expression remained stern. Councilman, the time for cooperation was before you became a criminal. The time for doing the right thing was before you accepted $380,000 in bribes. Now you'll face the consequences. And I hope those consequences include never holding public office again. As FBI agents began escorting DeLuca toward the courtroom doors, Judge Caprio delivered his final statement to the disgraced politician. Councilman DeLuca, you said I was an old fool who needed to remember who controls the money. But you forgot something important about how our system works. Judges don't serve politicians. We serve the law and the Constitution. You can control budgets. You can threaten careers. You can use political power to intimidate people. But you cannot corrupt the judicial system. Not in my courtroom. The officers led DeLuca out. His expensive suit was rumpled, his perfect hair disheveled. His Rolex would soon be seized as evidence. The powerful politician was gone, replaced by a defendant facing decades in federal prison. After DeLuca was removed, Judge Caprio addressed the courtroom, which included several nervous-looking city officials in the gallery. Let this be a lesson to every elected official, every person in a position of power. Your political position doesn't place you above the law. Your budget authority doesn't give you the right to threaten judges. Your years in office don't grant you immunity from consequences. When you abuse power, when you take bribes, when you threaten the independence of the judiciary, you don't just break laws. You break the social contract that makes democratic government possible. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down, and what had started as a parking ticket had become the biggest political corruption scandal to hit Providence in 20 years. The aftermath of DeLuca's arrest created seismic shockwaves throughout Providence city government. Within 48 hours, the FBI had arrested 4 more city officials connected to DeLuca's corruption network: the deputy mayor, 2 planning department officials, and another city councilman, all facing federal charges. Within a week, the mayor held a press conference announcing a complete overhaul of city contracting procedures and the creation of an independent ethics commission with subpoena power. DeLuca's attorney, Vincent Romano, was investigated by the Rhode Island Bar Association for potential knowledge of his client's crimes. While not charged criminally, Romano's reputation was destroyed, and his practice collapsed within months. The investigation expanded rapidly. Developers who had paid bribes to DeLuca began cooperating with prosecutors to reduce their own legal exposure. Bank records revealed that DeLuca had hidden over $600,000 in offshore accounts. Real estate holdings purchased with bribe money were identified and seized. The total corruption was staggering. Over 5 years, DeLuca had accepted more than $1.2 million in bribes, rigged dozens of city contracts, and threatened or intimidated at least 15 different people who had tried to expose his corruption. 6 months after his arrest, Anthony DeLuca stood in federal court for sentencing. He had pleaded guilty to 18 counts in exchange for prosecutors dropping additional charges. His cooperation had helped expose other corrupt officials, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The federal judge showed no mercy. "Mr. DeLuca," the judge said at sentencing, "you were elected to serve the people of Providence. Instead, you served yourself. You turned public office into a criminal enterprise. You threatened judges, intimidated witnesses, and corrupted the very institutions you swore to uphold." The sentence was severe: 15 years in federal prison, forfeiture of $1.3 million in assets and illegal gains, permanent ban from holding a public office, and restitution to the city of Providence of $800,000. Standing in court to hear his sentence, DeLuca was a broken man. The confident councilman was gone, replaced by a 47-year-old facing 15 years in prison and the destruction of everything he'd built. "I convinced myself that everyone was doing it," DeLuca said in a brief statement. "I told myself that bribes and threats were just how politics worked. I was wrong. I betrayed my constituents, corrupted city government, and thought I could threaten a judge into submission. I destroyed my family, my career, and my freedom because of greed and arrogance." The video of DeLuca's arrest went viral, viewed over 6 million times in the first week. Political science courses began using it as a case study on political corruption. Ethics training programs for elected officials made it required viewing. Judge Frank Caprio's role in the investigation earned him national recognition. In subsequent interviews, he reflected on the case with characteristic humility. "When Councilman DeLuca threatened me, when he said he'd cut my budget and ruin my career, he gave me 2 choices. I could be intimidated and let corruption continue, or I could stand up and fight back. The choice was easy. I took an oath to uphold the law. That oath doesn't have an exception for powerful politicians who threaten me," he continued. The saddest part is that DeLuca could have been a good public servant. He was smart, charismatic, politically skilled. But he chose corruption over service. He chose bribes over integrity. And when someone tried to hold him accountable, he chose threats over accepting responsibility. That's not just criminal behavior. That's a fundamental betrayal of democratic governance. 5 years later, Anthony DeLuca remains in federal prison. His political career is over. His fortune is gone. His reputation is destroyed. The city council seat he held for 12 years is now occupied by a reform candidate who won on an anti-corruption platform. Providence city government implemented comprehensive reforms following the scandal. All contract awards now go through independent review. Budget committee decisions require public disclosure. Ethics complaints are investigated by an independent commission with subpoena power. And threatening judges, even implicitly, became grounds for immediate recall of elected officials. The recording of DeLuca threatening Judge Caprio became legendary in judicial circles. It's played in law schools to teach about judicial independence. It's used in political ethics courses to demonstrate the consequences of corruption. And it serves as a permanent reminder that some judges refuse to be intimidated, no matter how much political power a defendant believes they possess. Judge Caprio, who presided over the hearing that exposed DeLuca's corruption, continued serving with distinction. When asked about memorable cases, he always mentioned DeLuca, not for the drama, but for the principle it represented. Judicial independence isn't just a legal concept, he explained. It's the foundation of our democracy. When politicians think they can threaten judges, intimidate courts, and corrupt the legal system, they're not just breaking laws. They're attacking the very idea that all people, even powerful politicians, are equal under the law. Today, when Providence politicians consider using their positions for personal gain, many remember Anthony DeLuca. They remember the councilman who thought he could threaten a judge and ended up in federal prison for 15 years. They remember the wiretap recording played in open court before his arrest. They remember that corruption, intimidation, and abuse of power have consequences. And they remember Judge Frank Caprio's words. You can control budgets. You can threaten careers. You can use political power to intimidate people. But you cannot corrupt the judicial system, not in my courtroom. That's not just good jurisprudence. It's the defense of democratic principles that every judge must be willing to make. Anthony DeLuca learned, as all corrupt officials eventually learn, that threatening judges doesn't make you powerful. It makes you a criminal. And Judge Caprio made sure that lesson was learned in the most public, most permanent way possible.